June 2, 1953. Westminster Abbey. 1,000 guests packed into the nave, the gilded weight of centuries pressing down on every surface. Outside, 3 million people lined the streets of London to watch the new Queen pass in her carriage. Inside, amid the robes and the incense and the carefully choreographed solemnity, a young woman reached out and brushed a piece of lint from a man's uniform. Nobody should have noticed, but a photographer did. That small gesture, Princess Margaret, that flick of a wrist, Peter Townsend's lapel, would set off a chain of consequences that ended in a public announcement, a broken engagement, and a heartbroken princess who spent the rest of her life apportioning blame between two men. One of them was Winston Churchill. The other was the man most people have never heard of. Every royal scandal you think you know, the abdication, the love affair they crushed, the king they decided was unfit to rule. There was one man in the room for all of it. He wasn't a prince. He was never on a stamp. His name was Tommy Lascelles, and for nearly 30 years he was the most powerful man in the British monarchy that the public never saw. He served 4 monarchs, 3 kings, and then the queen who came after. He helped force one of them off the throne. He sat across from a heartbroken princess and quietly ended the great love of her life. He knew which royals drank, which ones lied, which marriages were a fiction maintained for the cameras, and he wrote almost none of it down, because his job was to make sure you never found out. This is the story of the man who kept the secrets, and the handful he couldn't keep. Born on April 11, 1887, in the village of Sutton Waldron, Dorset, Alan Frederick Lascelles came into the world on the outer edge of one of England's great aristocratic dynasties. His grandfather was Henry Lascelles, 4th Earl of Harewood, one of Yorkshire's grandest titles, a name attached to a vast estate, and a fortune with roots in Caribbean plantation ownership. Tommy was the grandson of that man, but through the younger son's line. Close enough to the aristocracy to carry its assumptions and connections, not close enough to inherit its wealth. His first cousin Henry Lascelles, the 6th Earl, married Princess Mary, the only daughter of King George V and the sister of Edward VIII and George VI. Tommy, in other words, entered royal service already related to the family he served. That proximity, social and biological, gave him something most courtiers lacked, an absolute absence of awe. His father, Commander Frederick Lascelles, had retired from the Royal Navy at 30 and spent the next 40 years, in Tommy's own telling, hunting 4 days a week through autumn, shooting through winter, and going to Norway for salmon in summer. When Tommy's mother died of cancer while he was 3 years old, his father shipped him off to preparatory school at 9 and largely left him there. The childhood ran on formality and loneliness in roughly equal measure. Marlborough College, then Trinity College, Oxford, reading greats, Latin, Greek, philosophy, history. He graduated with a second-class degree that biographer Sally Bedell Smith charitably attributed to his work habits rather than his abilities. That was almost certainly true. Tommy at Oxford was less interested in examinations than in horses, conversation, Brahms, Shakespeare, and the company of men he described as those who understood books, horses, music, and found liberty from the dour conventionality. He left shaped by friendships, not grades. The First World War resolved the question of what he was made of. He served with the Bedfordshire Yeomanry in France and Flanders, reached the rank of captain, was wounded in action, and earned the Military Cross. More than a dozen of his close friends were killed, while his cavalry regiment waited in reserve. He grieved them individually and precisely. When Julian Grenfell, the eldest son of the First Lord Desborough, and a man Tommy had admired intensely at Oxford, died at Ypres in May 1915 after a shell fragment struck him in the head, Lascelles described him as the best of men, with amazing looks. A rather refined Botticelli Mars, leaner, harder, and more forceful. He wasn't a man who kept feeling at a distance. He simply kept it invisible. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 140 pounds. Duff Hart Davis described his moral outlook as severe, and his code of conduct as unbending. Eileen Parker, whose husband Mike worked in the royal household, wrote that most people were a little frightened of him. He tended to be very short with sloppiness and bad judgment. Winston Churchill, characteristically, refused to use his nickname, calling him Alan, while the entire court called him Tommy. Ferdinand Mount, the writer, remembered encountering Lascelles at his school and being startled by his explosion of venom against the Duke of Windsor. He was memorably unpleasant. That phrase, memorably unpleasant, is one of the most efficient summaries in the literature on this man. Unpleasant on the surface, memorable because the surface was nowhere near the whole story. He married Joan Thesiger in March 1920 in Delhi, after proposing to her among the Lodi king's tombs while supposedly working as an aide-de-camp to his brother-in-law in Bombay. He had met her at a wild elephant roundup in Mysore, watched her kill a 9-foot tigress with one shot, and apparently decided immediately. He wrote to a friend that he'd tumbled into such a seventh heaven of happiness as I never hoped to reach. 3 children followed. He meant all of it, and in that same year, 1920, he entered royal service. A letter arrived from a friend, Letty Elcho, offering a position as assistant private secretary to Edward, Prince of Wales. The salary was £600 a year. The prince was the most publicly admired young man in the British Empire, charismatic, tour-hardened, beloved by crowds from Canada to South Africa. Tommy took the job. He wrote at the time that he had a very deep admiration for the prince, and was convinced that the future of England is as much in his hands as in any individual. That admiration wouldn't survive the decade. To understand what happened next, and at every crisis point in the 30 years that followed, you need to understand what the position of private secretary to the sovereign actually meant, not the official description, what it meant in practice. The office was first created in 1805 under King George III, with a colonel named Herbert Taylor. By the 20th century, it had evolved, unplanned and undocumented, into something with no precise constitutional definition, but enormous practical power. The private secretary was the principal channel of communication between the monarch and every government in the Commonwealth. He controlled what correspondence reached the sovereign's desk. He managed access, who got an audience, who didn't, whose letters were read and whose were redirected. He drafted the speeches that the sovereign delivered as though they were the monarch's own. He liaised with cabinet secretaries, the Privy Council Office, and the Crown Office over every document requiring royal signature. The constitutional scholar Vernon Bogdaner, writing for Oxford University Press, described the role as crucial to the working of constitutional monarchy, noting that it operated through custom and precedent, with no formal document defining its limits. Formally, the private secretary acted only in the monarch's name. Practically, he shaped how that name was deployed. The position required someone who could command the confidence not only of the sovereign, but of the prime minister and the leader of the opposition simultaneously. A permanent secretary in terms of seniority, a privy councillor from the day of appointment. The desk was, in short, the most powerful, unelected position in British public life that nobody talked about. And in 1950, Lascelles proved it. He published a letter to the Times under the pseudonym Senex, Latin for old man, setting out 3 conditions under which a wise sovereign might refuse a prime minister's request to dissolve parliament. If the existing parliament was still viable, if an election would damage the national economy, or if the sovereign could identify another prime minister capable of forming a working government. These became known as the Lascelles Principles. They were cited in constitutional debates during the 2010 hung Parliament. They were cited again during the 2019 prorogation crisis. A serving private secretary, writing under a false name, shaped public constitutional doctrine from behind the curtain. That was Tommy Lascelles, standing where the audience couldn't see, quietly defining the rules. By 1927, 7 years into his service with Edward as Prince of Wales, the man who had described the prince as the future of England was writing something rather different. Words like decency, honesty, duty, dignity, and so on, Lascelles recorded, meant absolutely nothing to him. This was a written verdict, set down in letters and journals, apparently with posterity in mind. And it wasn't the sharpest thing he said. The story that circulates most widely from these years is that during the late 1920s, Lascelles told a companion, and the companion passed it along, that the best thing for the country would be if Edward broke his neck in a riding accident. The account, in multiple secondary sources drawing on the same body of published correspondence, includes a coda. That when this was relayed to Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister reportedly replied that, God forgive him, he had often thought the same. The wording is consistent across multiple sources. What the story represents, sourced or not, is the character of a man who had watched years of a prince drink, gamble, neglect his duties, and treat his position with something close to contempt, and had finally run out of diplomatic language for it. In January 1929, after a tour of Africa, Lascelles resigned. He was 41, a married man with 3 children and no immediate income. He gave up one of the most privileged positions in England because he could no longer maintain the professional pretense that his employer was worth serving. He described what happened when he finally said it to Edward's face. He paced the room for the best part of an hour, telling him, as I might have told a younger brother, exactly what I thought of him and his whole scheme of life, and foretelling, with an accuracy that might have surprised me at the time, that he would lose the throne of England. The prince was surprised. Lascelles wasn't. He spent some years at home with Joan, then took a post as private secretary to the Governor-General of Canada, serving until 1935. When he was asked to return to royal service that year as assistant private secretary to King George V, he hesitated, pointing out that having told the next in line he would lose his throne, his position would become extremely awkward the moment George V died. Sir Clive Wigram, who was hiring him, told him not to worry. The king was in splendid health. He had years left in him. George V died on January 20th, 1936. Lascelles, having just started a first-class train journey to Norfolk to take up his new post, found himself sharing a carriage with the Duke of York, the future George VI, who looked in and said halfway through the journey, "What's all this about the king not being well?" Within 4 days, George V was dead, Edward VIII was king, and Lascelles was once again technically in the service of a man he had told, a decade earlier, that he was unfit for the role. By June 1936, the palace resolved the awkwardness by reassigning Lascelles to serve the Duke of York. So when the abdication crisis finally broke in December, when Edward's determination to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson became a constitutional confrontation with Prime Minister Baldwin and the cabinet, Lascelles was watching from the adjacent room, already in the service of the man who would replace Edward. His formal constitutional position gave him no power over Baldwin or the cabinet. The abdication was managed by the government, but Lascelles had direct, private communication with Baldwin during this period, what one historian, drawing on Adrian Phillips's work on the hidden politics of the crisis, describes as a secret colloquy with the Prime Minister. He was embedded in every relevant social and professional network, and after the instrument of abdication was signed on December 10, 1936, and took effect on December 11th, Lascelles went out into the London night and walked 3 times around St. James's Park in the darkness, thinking, the record says, of James II. He called the abdication a real tragedy in my life. Not because he had loved Edward, because he had loved the institution. And the institution had nearly broken under the weight of a man he had warned, in writing, a decade before it happened. 3 days later, he had lunch with Harold Nicholson. He described Edward as like a child in the fairy stories who had been given every gift except a soul. He said the former king had never cared about England or the English. His published diaries, which begin with the abdication, describe Edward VIII's character at length and without charity. His editor, Duff Hart Davis, summarized the overall verdict in the introduction. Tommy came to regard Edward, Prince of Wales, as hopelessly selfish and irresponsible, and quite unfit for his future role as sovereign. He never revised that view. George VI became king. Lascelles became, over the next 7 years, indispensable. In 1943, after maneuvering the resignation of Sir Alexander Harding, who had served as private secretary since 1936, Lascelles was promoted to principal private secretary to the king. He served through the entirety of the Second World War, during which he was among a small handful of people privy to knowledge of the atomic bomb's development, through the death of George VI in February 1952 and into the first year of Elizabeth II's reign. George VI liked him. Churchill used his formal name and argued with him, but respected him. When the king knighted him during the royal tour of Canada in 1939, giggling as he did it, Lascelles noted in his diary that he could fairly claim to be the first man ever to be dubbed in a moving train, and the first Englishman knighted by his sovereign on American soil. He accepted the ceremony with the same dry pleasure he brought to everything. He turned down a peerage twice, from Churchill and once from the Queen. He accepted a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath on his retirement in 1953, which he said rated much higher than a peerage. He was also, during these years, supervising something even more consequential than his official duties. He managed the official biographies of George V, George VI, and Queen Mary, the 3 defining published accounts of the mid-century royal family. Harold Nicholson wrote the George V biography. John Wheeler Bennett wrote George VI's. James Pope Hennessy wrote Queen Mary's. All 3 manuscripts passed through Lascelles' judgment, shaped by what he called his sharpest blue pencil. What the books said, and what they didn't, was partly his decision. He wasn't just a witness to history, he was, quietly, one of its editors. Back to June 2, 1953. The lint on the lapel. The photograph. Peter Townsend was 38 years old, decorated Battle of Britain pilot, divorced since November 1952, and deeply in love with a woman 16 years his junior, who happened to be the sister of the head of state and the supreme governor of the Church of England. He had joined the royal household as equerry to George VI in 1944, and had been embedded in the family's daily life ever since. Margaret had told the Queen in April 1953 that she intended to marry him. The Queen had asked her to wait. Then the coronation happened, and the press happened, and by June, the relationship was public knowledge in every newspaper in America, Europe, and the Commonwealth. Lascelles was still private secretary. He was still the person whose job it was to manage consequences before they became crises, and crises before they became catastrophes. His response was direct. He called Townsend in. His words, documented by Ferdinand Mount in the London Review of Books, drawing on historical record. "You must be either mad or bad." 4 words, no ambiguity, no pastoral softening. This wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. Within weeks, Townsend was posted as air attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels. One contemporaneous account, from the Brussels branch of the British Legion, records that Lascelles personally informed Townsend his posting would start on July 15, 1953. He was the one who delivered the news, face to face with the same directness he had applied to the prince a quarter-century earlier. Townsend would later describe the posting to the BBC as a slightly disciplinary measure. That may qualify as the understatement of the decade. What Lascelles provably did is clear. He confronted Townsend directly, recommended that a posting be arranged, and personally communicated the specific departure date. What is less certain, and historians disagree, is how decisive his individual role was in triggering the posting versus managing a decision that had already been collectively reached by the palace and the government. Ferdinand Mount attributed initiative specifically to Lascelles, writing in the LRB that he persuaded Churchill to arrange the Brussels posting. That's a credible account from a credible publication, but it's one account. Other sources describe it as a collective determination. The pattern of how Lascelles had always operated, through access, through the weight of his office, through quiet pressure on the people with formal authority, makes the attribution plausible rather than certain. He retired from royal service on December 31, 1953, aged 66, succeeded by Sir Michael Adine. The final act of the Townsend affair, Princess Margaret's public statement, issued October 31, 1955, renouncing any possibility of marriage, came nearly 2 years after Lascelles had left the building. By then, Prime Minister Anthony Eden was driving it. The cabinet had agreed on the financial consequences of any marriage, and Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher had made the church's position clear through both private counsel and public television. Eden himself, who had barely avoided being cited as a co-respondent in a divorce proceeding years earlier, was the one who informed Margaret on October 1, 1955, that if she married Townsend, she would lose her royal status, her annual £6,000 civil list income, and her title. Lascelles had arranged the opening moves. The end game wasn't his. What remained his, permanently, was Princess Margaret's verdict. In a conversation recorded in the private journals of Kenneth Rose, the royal biographer and newspaper diarist, and first made public in 2019 in the Daily Express, Margaret told Jock Colville, a former aide to Churchill, that the two men who had ruined her life were Tommy Lascelles and Winston Churchill, who wouldn't let her marry Peter Townsend. Colville, per the account, replied that he couldn't speak to Tommy's role, but that Winston had not wanted to repeat the mistake of 1936. The record notes that Margaret wasn't pleased by this. She reportedly instructed her chauffeur to run Lascelles over whenever they passed him walking near Kensington Palace. He lived at Kensington Palace. So did she. If you've already watched the channel's existing videos on Margaret, on the Townsend years, on the marriage that followed, on the private sadness that ran beneath the public glamour, you know how the story ends. Lascelles is the invisible thread running through the parts you hadn't seen. Now you have both sides of the same room. Here is the question that sits at the center of all of this. What did he know that he didn't write down? His published diaries, King's Counselor, edited by Duff Hart Davis and published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in 2006, cover the period from the abdication in 1936 to the coronation in 1953. They are 462 pages. They were the third volume in the series of his published writing. End of an Era appeared in 1986, covering his early life and the years through 1920. In Royal Service appeared in 1989, covering 1920 to 1936. King's Counselor came last, in 2006. Lascelles died on August 10, 1981. 25 years elapsed between his death and that final publication. And when it appeared, the publisher confirmed it was released by permission of Her Majesty the Queen. His papers are held at Churchill College, Cambridge. A significant portion remains closed, at the request of both the Lascelles family and the royal librarian at Windsor. No specific explanation has been given, more than 4 decades after his death. Philip Ziegler, the author of the official biography of Edward VIII, visited Lascelles in his final years at Kensington Palace and has described what those visits were like. Lascelles would open a locked chest, take out a volume of his diary, read a few sentences aloud, sometimes 3 or 4, never more, and then replace it. On each occasion, his comment was the same. "That won't be seen by anyone for 50 years, he would say, with what Ziegler recalled as some relish. And then, "It's the duty of the private secretary to be private." Even his closest lifelong friend, the writer John Gore, admitted in the end, "At the essentials of his inner life, I find myself baffled." What we can document is the scale of what he witnessed. He was present and recording at close range from 1920 to 1953, through Edward VIII's years as Prince of Wales, which no published volume fully covers, through the abdication and its immediate aftermath, through 6 years of wartime under a king who was managing personal anxiety as much as national crisis, through the death of that king and the accession of his daughter. He supervised the official biographies of George V, George VI, and Queen Mary, meaning he read and shaped what those biographers were permitted to include. He communicated regularly with Harold Nicolson, one of the most prolific diarists of the century, using Nicholson as a conduit for royal information and impressions that don't appear in the official record. He wrote himself prolifically, exceptional fluency and precision, hardly ever crossing out a word, per Hart Davis, and locked most of it in a chest. His operating principle, when pressed, was unambiguous. He once told someone threatening to locate damaging material that, "My first duty will always be to the monarchy." Not to accuracy, not to posterity, to the institution. Walter Bagehot, the Victorian-era constitutional critic, wrote that for the British monarchy, mystery is its life, that "we must not let daylight in upon magic." Lascelles didn't quote Bagehot, he embodied him. For 30 years, he stood precisely at the point where the daylight was trying to get in. He moved to the old stables at Kensington Palace on retirement in 1953. It was a grace and favor house he considered one of the nicest in England. He read Shakespeare on the Underground on the way to meetings at the Midland Bank, where he served as a director. He became Secretary of the Literary Society and Director of the Royal Academy of Music. He declined 2 peerages and accepted 1 honor instead. He grew an ungainly beard and described himself cheerfully as looking like a pot-bellied old beaver. He watched the fireworks celebrations for the wedding of Charles and Diana on July 29, 1981, from the garden of Kensington Palace, reportedly asking for news about the event every few minutes, anxious that it should all be going well. He died 12 days later. Michael Adine succeeded him at the private secretary's desk. Martin Charteris succeeded Adine in 1972. Charteris, after his retirement, gave a notably candid interview to GQ magazine in 1995, speaking with a directness about Diana and the state of the royal family that would have made Lascelles wince. It represented a genuine departure from the model he had spent 30 years enforcing: silence after service, privacy as principle, no settlements with the public appetite for revelation. Whether that departure helped or damaged the institution Lascelles had protected is the question that runs beneath every royal story since. The Lascelles Principles he published pseudonymously in 1950 remain live constitutional doctrine. When the 2019 prorogation crisis convulsed Westminster, legal scholars and constitutional advisors reached back to a letter written by a retired courtier under a false name and found it still directly relevant. His footprint in the British Constitution is visible every time Parliament runs into the edges of what the Crown can and can't be asked to do. Tommy Lascelles died on August 10, 1981, at Kensington Palace, aged 94. He had served the monarchy from 1920 to 1953. He had been present at every flashpoint: the abdication, the war, the coronation, the love affair the palace wouldn't permit. He had written it down, selectively, and locked most of it away. He had told the people around him repeatedly that the private secretary's duty was to be private. He was right about most of it. And the things he was right about are still, in part, locked in a room in Cambridge. Tommy Lascelles believed the monarchy was a magic trick, and his job was to stand where the audience couldn't see and make sure the trick never failed. For 30 years, it didn't. Kings came and went, hearts were broken on his instruction, and the public received the version he allowed them. He died with most of it still sealed, but not all of it. And every secret that has slipped out since has only confirmed what the quiet man at the desk always knew. The crown doesn't survive on what it shows you. It survives on what it hides. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. There are more rooms in this palace and more doors still closed.